When I came to the hospital, it was packed.
Everyone thought I would die, and I didn't care if I did.
Every single minute is potentially a minute that could impact someone's life.
She made noises that no living thing should ever make.
What did they find?
It was just terrifying.
Really?
Yes, I heard that gasp. Yes, I gasped too when I heard that.
The place was filthy.
We were looking at a possible disaster.
Hello, welcome to Something's Killing Me. I'm BD Wong.
In the fall of 2012, several patients near Nashville, Tennessee fell ill and were diagnosed with meningitis. But when they started feeling worse after getting treatment, doctors realized they were dealing with something far more sinister. It would be weeks before the medical community discovered the full extent of what they were up against.
Eddie Lovelace was a circuit court judge in Kentucky. He spent more than 20 years on the bench, and before that, he'd been a state prosecutor.
My father was very healthy. He walked 3 miles a day. He had no ongoing health problems. He was still reviewing his law journals. He was still teaching Sunday school. His mind was extremely sharp.
On September 9th, 2012, Judge Lovelace did what he did every Sunday. He taught his Sunday school class. But for some reason on this Sunday, he became confused. And he actually had to leave the lesson partway through. And his family was very concerned.
He was complaining of headaches and dizziness. Then I think it was the following morning, he went out to get his newspaper and he fell. And that morning he told my mother, my legs aren't working right. That was totally unlike him. That had never happened before. So at that point, we made a decision to seek emergency medical care.
His daughter rushed him to the emergency room in Nashville, Tennessee, and they said, your father has had a stroke.
The symptoms he was experiencing were very unique. Dad's stroke occurred in a part of the brain where you only find that with individuals who have uncontrolled, prolonged high blood pressure, and Dad did not have that. Then I noticed he began to have prolonged periods where he appeared to just be unconscious. When he would come out of these episodes of unconsciousness, Dad would reach to shake hands with people that weren't there. Dad's cognitive abilities began to deteriorate rapidly to the point he couldn't communicate with us. The only thing that was keeping him alive was the medication. One of the nurses had made a comment that if we don't discontinue the medication, he might remain in a comatose state, and they discontinued the medication. Dad passed away some 8 hours after that.
They're a lovely family, and we visited them right after they had lost their husband, father, grandfather. They were really a family in great grief and in mourning. What do you miss?
He was the center of our universe as a family.
Now all his family can do is remember the devoted public servant, the grandfather who let his granddaughters play with Barbies behind the bench when they were little, while he heard court cases.
Oh, it's complete disbelief. Dad's illness didn't make sense to us because he was healthy.
Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, another man had the exact same condition, just nobody knew it.
Thomas Verbinski was a healthy guy. He was very active, according to his wife, did sports, did hiking and other activities, and suddenly he was acting like somebody twice his age.
Mr. Verbinski was a Tennessee auto worker, and one day he's feeling nauseous, he's feeling fatigued, goes to the doctor, and they don't know what's going on, but it doesn't seem all that serious.
He had been admitted to the hospital several weeks before I had met him with meningitis. The cause of the meningitis hadn't been determined, but he was sent home on IV antibiotics to complete a 2-week course of antibacterial medications. He had been home about a week before he came back with worse symptoms.
Mr. Rubinski is back in the hospital. He is having small seizures.
I was doing a 2-week block on call in the infectious diseases service. I was fairly new to the job, just having started as an attending physician in 2011. And my first day on this 2-week block was the first day that I had met the index patient. Normally, we would expect people with meningitis who are on the appropriate treatment to get better really quickly, like within a day or a couple of days. When I met him, wasn't able to really communicate or respond very well and was transferred to the intensive care unit. That was definitely a red flag that he was not getting better within a few days.
So you had this mystery unfolding in Tennessee. People were getting very sick. And what nobody knew, nobody realized, that something very similar was unfolding in Michigan.
We had seen about 6 patients that had presented with symptoms of meningitis. 6 patients for 1 month is a lot more than we typically would see for patients with meningitis. And the patients presented similarly in the sense that they presented with headaches, neck stiffness, sensitivity to light, chills. Often they had fevers. When we want to test for meningitis, what we do is we perform a spinal tap. And a sample of fluid is obtained. We look to see whether there are white blood cells. White blood cells are elevated when patients have meningitis. This is the body's response to an infection. We thought that this was a case of bacterial meningitis by looking at the amount of cells. There's thousands of white blood cells. Patients remained in the hospital for a few days and eventually went home with antibiotics. And then something surprising happened. Patients weren't getting better. Soon after being home, some of these patients actually came back with symptoms that were still similar. They weren't responding to different types of antibiotics. This was sort of pointing us away from traditional causes of meningitis.
I had a gut feeling that something wasn't right.
Mr. Rubinski is physically falling apart.
He was in an awful lot of pain.
Whenever you're trying to treat a patient and they're getting worse despite treatment, the urgency mounts as the days pass.
What no one knew was that his brain was being torn apart. And this was a man who was rapidly heading toward death, but for a reason that no one could have imagined.
Thomas Rubinski is back in the hospital after being treated for bacterial meningitis and not getting better. Now it's up to his doctor, April Pettit, to figure out what to do next.
Meningitis is an infection of the lining around the brain and the spinal cord. It can be caused by a lot of different things, including bacteria, viruses, fungus. Because he had gotten worse on treatment for bacterial causes of meningitis, we had to think about other causes, and probably next on the list would be fungal meningitis, although that is very uncommon, very rare.
In order to test for fungal meningitis, the spinal fluid has to be monitored for the growth of infectious organisms like bacteria or fungus.
Whereas bacteria will usually grow within a day or two, sometimes a fungal organism takes longer, could even take weeks. So we decided to start antifungal treatment even though we didn't have any laboratory evidence yet that it was a fungal infection. I mean, you want to start treatment as quickly as possible, and especially when you're talking about someone's brain function, you know, the urgency is even more. So next, we had gotten a call from the laboratory that the spinal fluid was growing a fungus. Spinal fluid's sterile. There should never be any bacteria, any fungus. My immediate reaction was surprise and wondering why would this patient have a fungal infection in his spinal fluid. He really had been quite healthy and hadn't had much of medical history except for some low back pain that had been going on for some time.
She immediately notified the Tennessee Health Department and Dr. Marion Kaner at the health department and told her that we have this very unusual case.
This was such a serious diagnosis, a case of a patient who had a normal immune system and they had fungal meningitis, which is highly unusual, and we wanted to find out exactly the circumstances. Why did he have this fungal meningitis?
This fungus is common in the environment. The most common way it can enter the body is being inhaled. Once the fungus enters the body, it can become bloodborne, and from there can go to the spinal cord and the brain. In this case, we took pictures of the patient's sinuses and lungs to look for signs of infection there and didn't see any. The only other way that it could have entered would be through a cut or something in the skin, and we did a good exam of his skin and didn't find any lesions anywhere. The only kind of history that we had gotten that the skin had been broken was during a steroid injection procedure.
The injections go into the spine and are intended to provide relief from spinal pain.
Many people get this treatment. It's very common.
For many years, I had back pain and didn't seem anything helped. So a friend told me about this clinic that gave the spinal injections to help the pain. They're not fun to get because they're sticking a needle in your spine. Anyhow, if it helped, it was definitely worth it. And so I've been having them about 3 years.
Then we actually heard about 2 additional patients who presented with meningitis. They did not know whether this was fungal meningitis. They did not have a diagnosis.
The only thing that was tying these patients together was the fact that they had some sort of infection, and it looked like a fungal infection.
And then we got a big clue. These 2 new patients had something in common with the first patient. They all had received injections at St. Thomas Outpatient Neurosurgical Center. And so that now makes one really think, hang on, there's something going on at that clinic in Tennessee. We went to the facility to observe the environment.
They were trying to figure out whether it was some other cause, like some issue with sterility at the clinic.
It's sort of like a disease detective. Like you rule out your suspects.
As it turns out, they did not find any problems at the clinic.
I contact the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC.
She wanted to know if the CDC had been alerted to any other cases that were similar to this.
At that time, they had not heard about any of these unusual events.
So in the beginning, all we knew were that there are a few patients with meningitis that were from the same outpatient clinic. But we didn't yet know how it all fit together.
And they also didn't know that hundreds of miles away, doctors in Michigan were dealing with the same issues.
We were quite alarmed when these patients were coming back. There were 6 patients, despite being on 3 antibiotics. They weren't getting better for bacterial meningitis. These patients are critically ill. These weren't the typical types of patients that we think of unusual causes of meningitis. They didn't have travel exposure. Their immune systems were normal. And then something surprising happened. We found out what they all had in common. All patients had received an epidural steroid injection.
That set off an alarm. Something injected into the spine makes a patient very vulnerable to very crippling diseases because it'll go straight to the brain through the spinal canal.
Back in Tennessee, health officials had already eliminated the local clinic as the source of the contamination and were now zeroing in on the medication itself.
We needed to know, well, were there other people that had received this steroid that were also sick? Because that would, number one, tell us if it was the medication or not.
So we sent out an alert through a Tennessee Health Alert Network to our partners in our hospitals, asking them to report any cases of fungal meningitis, especially if they had a steroid injection in their back in a certain time frame. So over the next few days, we heard about additional patients in Tennessee.
The light went off when they began to get back all this feedback about who the patients were that were getting sick. And then they realized that the common denominator was the steroids.
The victims in this case got it from a tainted batch of this steroid, methylprednisone acetate. The manufacturer is the New England Compounding Center in Framingham, Massachusetts.
I was hoping this was going to be a local issue, but I was very concerned that it was not. Maybe it was only 1 or 2 clinics.
We were worried that this could be a mass casualty event, to be honest with you.
In September of 2012, health officials in Tennessee determined the likely source of the meningitis outbreak was a steroid medication injected into the spines of patients suffering from severe pain. And that steroid, they learned, was created over 1,000 miles away at a facility in Massachusetts called New England Compounding Center.
A compounding pharmacy is very different from the retail pharmacies that all of us are used to. A compounding pharmacy, they make the drug right there in their own facilities.
Healthcare providers sometimes turn to compounding pharmacies when they need to order a specially made drug for one of their patients.
And so when we heard that this came from a compounding pharmacy, that rang alarm bells, because we knew that compounding pharmacies had been associated with outbreaks in the past.
Unlike retail pharmacies that are strictly regulated, compounding pharmacies usually operate with less oversight.
At this stage, we think about getting the product off the shelf. And so we arrange for a conference call where we can have the compounding pharmacy itself on a phone call with us together with the CDC. We described that their steroid product was our absolute prime suspect.
We wanted to also find out was if any of their customers had called NECC to say that they had a complaint with a medication, and at that point they had denied that they had any complaints about their medication to us.
NECC also gave them an assurance that they followed all the rules.
We knew that we had to work really fast to make sure that we had the evidence that this was indeed the product which we had to get off the shelf to prevent additional patients being exposed. So I and my team worked night and day to work out what that was. I literally brought in an exercise mat, a pillow, and a blanket, and I tried to get a few snoozes in between. And when they found out for sure it was the steroid from the New England Compounding Center that was causing this whole thing. Hearing that a fungus was found in the vial made us relieved that we knew what the culprit was, that we had a firm diagnosis.
So the next phase of our investigation was to try to limit the harm, to try to contain the number of people that become ill and the number of people that have severe infection and death because of this. So at this point, we've asked the New England Compounding Center for their customer list, and we don't yet quite know what we're going to get. We don't know how many clinics and how many patients ultimately have been exposed.
I absolutely remember the moment that I had received the email with the distribution list and the number of vials that were distributed. And my heart just sank. And I was thinking, oh my God.
We saw that this list contained 23 states. Ultimately, it turns out that there were 14,000 people that had received this steroid medication.
This is not a distribution of sales. This is a distribution of death. Every one of these recipients could be injecting poison unknowingly.
And it was just terrifying that so many patients would be exposed. Fungal meningitis has a really high mortality, and knowing that there were so many people who were potentially exposed to this medication, it was one of the scariest times in my life.
At this point, about half of the people that we knew about were dying, had strokes and were dying.
The entire country was living on borrowed time.
So we start calling clinics to try to find out if any other patients that received the steroid were also sick.
The very next day, the CDC gets notified by a hospital from North Carolina that a patient there, Elwina Shaw, is suffering from the very same symptoms of meningitis that they're investigating.
And who also had been exposed to the same product, the same steroid from NECC.
Elwina Shaw was the proof, was the evidence that something happening around the country.
Mother's health was deteriorating very rapidly. She had strokes. She began to have problems with speech. She made noises that no living thing should ever make, ever. There were moans and groans that I hear in my head. My mother passed away about a month and a half after getting sick. It's tough. It's tough to see a living human being suffer the death my mother suffered. It is so hard to go back and visit those days.
Once it turned out that there was a case in another state, it was a hello moment from both the federal government and the local government that this is not a Tennessee problem, this is a national problem.
There was a lot of dread. There was a lot of concern. We were worried that this could be a mass casualty event, to be honest with you.
That's when I got involved. We could be dealing with a large-scale problem that no one has any idea how to clinically manage.
The CDC has activated its Emergency Operations Center, and we have mobilized hundreds of staff around the agency to work on this.
As we were calling patients, we were letting them know you might have been exposed through an injection in your spine to this contaminated steroid that could have a fungal infection.
And there were 14,000 people. So this was really a Herculean effort involving CDC, health departments, clinicians, doctors, nurses.
We knew that over 1,000 patients in Tennessee had received these injections, and we had to track these patients down really rapidly. And so we had to use multiple different methods, finding out where people were on vacation, speaking to law enforcement.
Sheriff's Department was actually going and knocking on doors.
Looking on Facebook, trying to track these people down. We traced people down to a tour operator in Yellowstone Park. I mean, we traced people all across the country, including some internationally. But we're not involving the general media.
They didn't want to cause a panic. On the advice of the CDC, they kept this quiet.
I started to get headaches and neck pain, and then I started to throw up more, and we didn't know what was going on. Then I was just laying in bed, and I got a phone call, and it was the CDC. When I found out that I had the fungal meningitis, officially, we were scared. We did not know much about it. We just had no idea at the time how much it would affect my life.
It wasn't until October 1st that the Tennessee Health Department made the first public announcement that this outbreak was going on.
We feel comfortable at this point saying it's an outbreak.
We informed the public that there was this outbreak of fungal infections, and there was a product, this steroid from NECC, that was the cause of these infections.
We would like to note that these products have been sequestered, so they have been taken out of service.
Sunday night on the news, we heard about the tainted injections from the New England Compound Center, and I thought, oh dear, that's me. The last injection I had was September 7th, 2012. And 3 weeks later, I started having a terrible headache, lower back pain, especially my tailbone. They said to go to the hospital where you received your injection, and that's what I did Monday morning.
Once we had the news coming from the CDC that indeed epidural steroid injections were contaminated with a fungus, these patients began coming in within the first weekend.
You start having the death and disease piling up very fast.
We were looking at a possible public health disaster. And when I realized this, I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff and I couldn't see the bottom. I didn't know how far this went.
It was going to be treating people on a scale that we had never heard of before.
And that every single minute is potentially a minute that could impact someone's life.
Welcome back to Something's Killing Me. After the fungal meningitis outbreak became national news, hospitals across the country started filling up with people who feared the worst. And health officials who'd never dealt with an outbreak of this magnitude were in a race against time to not only find a treatment, but to track down the people who could be infected.
The thing that we really wanted to do was make a proactive outreach to anyone that had received the injection. Hey, you need to come in right away if you have these types of symptoms because this may be life-threatening.
When I came to the hospital, it was packed. There was probably 10, 15 people in there suffering, you know, moaning and in pain. And I happened to see my doctor. He came up and looked at me and said, "Oh my God, you got it. I can see it in your eyes."
And the story was sort of unfolding before us. It wasn't that there were textbooks and literature to turn to and say, hey, this is how you handle this type of fungal infection.
I've been doing public health now for about 20 years, but we haven't treated 14,000 people with fungal infections ever.
There's not a lot of experience in treating this, but we're getting the best experts together to try and formulate what people think may be a good course of action to go and take.
I didn't know of a situation where we had assembled a clinical group of experts, and especially in this, just this very narrow field of fungal infections, to deal with a new infection that none of us had ever dealt with before in a very short period of time. And you get 10 fungal experts around the table, and you're gonna have 10 different opinions on what to do. How am I going to get them to agree to something within 24 to 48 hours, where it usually takes us over a year to agree to a single treatment guideline for a particular infection?
Every single minute is potentially a minute that could impact someone's life.
We became sort of the epicenter of this outbreak. Very first weekend, between the Friday through the Sunday, we did probably 50 spinal taps.
You know, it was just like people in a procession to go in there and get it done. Met me over a table and stuck a needle in my spine.
Entire emergency rooms were just packed full of people trying to get diagnosed.
They could tell from analyzing the spinal fluid whether they had been infected by this steroid.
Once I tested positive, they said I'm staying in the hospital. I couldn't leave. It was an outbreak. You know, that's what scared the hell out of me.
We had whole wards where every patient on the ward actually had a fungal infection. We cared for 195 patients here.
When we think about treating infections in general, the first thing we do is we take that organism, we stick it in a test tube, and we put the drugs in with it. So we first see, does it die in the test tube? So in other words, we test it against a number of drugs. Ultimately, we arrived at a drug called voriconazole, which was killing this organism in the test tube. One thing about antifungal drugs is if it wasn't working, we didn't have a lot of options in our back pocket. I was very concerned that patients were gonna do really bad. I was probably on the phone with 10, 20, 30 clinicians every day asking about how treatment was going, about what the patients looked like.
We were monitoring drug levels of the voriconazole. There was a specific sort of therapeutic range that we wanted to try to hit. Really, we're playing around with the medications and trying to optimize how patients can best receive these.
We started hearing on people doing better. Certainly hearing from Dr. Milani and others out there who were treating patients and hearing the good news about the use of voriconazole being used successfully, that was really good news. But one of the trade-offs for using a drug that penetrates into your brain, where we were concerned that the fungus could be, is that those drugs often have side effects on the brain itself.
Some people thought the cure was worse than the disease. These people really suffered twice.
It was the difficulties with cognition, memory, concentration, and just getting around their daily living.
It was just, it's a horrific medicine. Takes your short-term memory away. I mean, you can't remember anything.
So I was having like a lot of auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations. I could hear things that weren't actually happening, and I could see things that weren't there.
Once I thought one of my grandchildren was under the bed. Once I sat up, I heard people in the hall, and I sat up, I said, "Are those our people? Are those our people?"
It was hallucinations, the rigors, shaking. That was hell. For the next 6 months after that, I still had a ghost follow me around and weird movements in my arms, and it was a nightmare.
When all of this came to light, we thought, how could this have happened?
We're with CNN. We were trying to get a hold of somebody to talk to about what's been going on here.
Unfortunately, I have to ask you guys to leave the property.
Two people have died, 11 others remain in the hospital.
A deadly meningitis outbreak has now spread to 5 states. 4 people are dead.
Prevention now says there are 35 cases in 6 states.
This whole tragedy came out of this tiny little nondescript building that looks like something you would see, your local tax attorney working in.
New England Compounding Center was basically a strip mall. If you went by, you'd never think that this was some place they were preparing sterile drugs. The president of NECC was Barry Cadden. He was a pharmacist by trade. Underneath him was Glenn Chin, who was the supervising pharmacist in the clean room where they were making these spinal drugs.
In October 2012, health officials raid NECC and they walk into a horror show. They see that employees are scrubbing the place down with bleach, trying to hide what they were doing. But it was impossible. The place was filthy.
What did they find?
When they went in there, they actually found fungus in a vial that you could see with the naked eye.
Really?
Yes, I heard that gasp. Yes, I gasped too when I heard that.
There were, bacteria-filled, filthy mats on the floor. There was rusted equipment. You had vents that were supposed to be sucking out any possible microorganisms, and those vents themselves were covered in mold.
Who would have even imagined that a company that was compounding drugs to put in someone's spine would allow their facility to have mold? It just is unimaginable to me, and that's criminal.
When I went over to the NECC, they really didn't want to have anything to do with us.
We're with CNN. We were trying to get a hold of somebody to talk to about what's been going on here.
Unfortunately, I have to ask you guys to leave the property.
They literally are telling us to leave the parking lot, not even be here. We know people from the FDA are inside.
Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta got as far as their parking lot. He was told to leave. He managed to take a look behind their facility, though, and what he found was pretty surprising. A recycling site filled with waste and garbage right next to the building where inside medications are being mixed.
It looks like a garbage dump, and again, this backs up right to this compounding center, a place where they process medications for human use. I'd never seen anything like it.
There were these rotting things, a perfect source of fungus, and it was close enough to the drug facility where the air could have easily come through.
I think the thing about this story in particular was the complete lack of accountability from the people at the very top.
The deadly meningitis outbreak is growing today. 38 people in 6 states are now fighting it.
But NECC wasn't only negligent, it was also breaking the law. They were only allowed to produce 1 drug for every prescription they had, but they were producing far more medicine than they had orders for.
Rather than creating individual drugs for individual patients, they were making them by large batches.
They were doing it out of pure profit motives.
The number of cases jumped to at least 91. The outbreak is far from over.
If these had not been mass-produced and mass-distributed drugs, it would have never created the sort of epidemic that we saw. So it was part a hygiene problem and in part a distribution problem. They created a bad product and then spread it widely.
Another 120 people nationwide are sick from the rare fungal meningitis.
Had people not been so concerned about their profit margin, my dad would probably be alive today.
When all of this came to light, we thought, how could this have happened?
They were taking enormous risks. They cut every corner they could.
The CDC says there are now 185 cases of the non-contagious illness in a dozen states.
The NECC had been investigated before. They'd been cited for hygiene and sanitation issues.
It goes nowhere. So they get a clean bill of health and they go back to work.
There were tapes that were seized from NECC.
How can they come in and inspect me? They don't even know what they're looking at. They have no clue. They go around, they're like, oh, Barry's place looks great. Yeah, I gotta go. A cup of coffee, and they go out the door.
He was bragging about what a wonderful job they were doing.
Why they weren't on the state's radar is a mystery.
I felt like, okay, at last, there might be some justice in this case.
There's people that have died and nobody's being accountable for it.
New developments in the deadly meningitis outbreak. 198 cases are confirmed across 13 states.
24 people have died in this outbreak, and more than 300 have gotten sick.
The CDC stopped counting after 1 year. The FDA determined that there were, in fact, 76 people who died. The exact number of people who died and the exact number of people who became sick in varying degrees will probably never be known.
Eventually, the walls closed in on these guys. And criminal prosecutors recognized the scope of the crime they committed. So NECC goes out of business. NECC is gone.
The end of 2014, the grand jury issued an indictment of 14 people, all of them in some way connected with NECC.
They were charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, violating rules for the safety of medication, bank fraud, and racketeering. NECC was an entity that engaged not in a few, in hundreds of crimes. Glenn Chin was in an airport with his family getting ready to fly to Hong Kong, and he was arrested. Barry Cadden got up at 4 a.m. He got dressed in nice clothes, and then he waited for law enforcement to come knocking on his door to take him off to jail.
Barry Cadden and Glenn Chin were also charged with second-degree murder for 25 of the deaths.
The first point when I felt like there might be some justice in this case was when the individuals were indicted. I felt like, okay, at last, something's going to occur.
The beginning of the Cadden trial was a circus. The courtroom was packed. Cadden defense was based basically on blaming Chin. Cadden contended that Chin was doing all this stuff unbeknownst to him and cutting all these corners. Chin's defense was basically blaming it on Cadden. Chin said he was just following Cadden's orders. The jury in both Cadden and Chin's case did not convict on the second-degree murder charges. Ultimately, the jury convicted them of racketeering, conspiracy, mail fraud. Cadden was sentenced to a 9-year sentence. Chin was sentenced to 8 years in prison.
People get a lot more years for, like, drug charges even.
There's people that have died and nobody's being accountable for it.
If I had an opportunity to speak to Barry Cadden or to Glenn Chin, I would simply ask them, when you took the oaths within your profession, was the word profit margin listed anywhere in that?
Glenn Chin's going to prison for 8 years. Hopefully I got 8 years.
We can't overlook the impact this has on the over 750 people who managed to survive. The future that they expected has been robbed from them.
Basically, my entire life has changed after this. I can't continue my education. A lot of the classes I've had to drop out of just because I can't get to class some days because I'm in so much pain. I've had to change my goals in life completely, and it's just not gonna be the same ever again.
This has shortened my life. It aged me at least 10 years, and my husband and children can tell you that.
I spent 197 days in the hospital. My hospital bill is incredible. We were at the top of our earning potential. We had to downsize our whole life. I struggled daily. My kidneys are failing. Life's not good.
What was frightening was that there were many steps along the way, it seemed, where this thing could have been totally prevented.
Dad's death took a tremendous, tremendous toll on my mother. She and my father envisioned a future in which he would eventually retire and they would be able to do things together that they hadn't been, and that never occurred. Mom's by herself in life now.
Could this happen again? Of course it could.
I don't know if there's ever gonna be an end to this. I got a death sentence the rest of my life.
Most of the victims and their families have filed lawsuits against NECC and won. But many of the survivors say it's still not enough. Congress has since taken measures to prevent this from happening again. In late 2013, lawmakers passed the Drug Quality and Security Act, which gives the FDA greater power to oversee and regulate compounding pharmacies. Thanks for watching. I'm BD Wong. Good night.